I stared at my reflection in the mirror, adjusting the collar of my blouse just so. The soft hum of the house around me, the clink of dishes being put away in the kitchen, the distant sound of the television in the living room, seemed far removed from the thoughts swirling in my head. I knew what I had to do. I had been planning this for months, maybe even longer. I had to push him to the edge, make him bend, make him break, until he was nothing more than a shell of the man he used to be. But I couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the thought of it all. Daniel had always been perfect, or at least that's how he appeared on the surface. A successful architect, a doting father, the kind of husband every woman dreams of. But in truth, I was suffocating in his perfection. He was predictable, stable, exactly what I should have wanted, yet something deep inside me craved chaos. I needed something more than this dull routine. And Daniel? Well, he was my perfect target. I hadn't always planned for it to go this far. At first, it had been small, little nudges here and there. A well-timed comment, a glance that lingered a second too long, planting the seeds of doubt in his mind. I watched him, the way he interacted with the world around him, the way he interacted with me. I studied his vulnerabilities like an artist who knows every curve of their canvas. I wanted to make him question himself, to make him believe he wasn't enough for me. I used to admire his strength. Now, it irritated me. He was so self-assured, so unshakable. His success at work, his ability to keep everything under control, it all seemed like a mask, one that had been carefully crafted over the years. But masks can only hide so much, can't they? Eventually, they crack. It started with the little things. He'd come home from work, his brow furrowed, shoulders tense from a long day. I'd make dinner, of course, act like the loving wife. But I knew what he needed. I'd talk about his projects, ask him about the pressure at the office, and then, casually, I'd mention how hard it must be to balance everything. He'd nod, the weight of his responsibilities hanging on him like a cloak. And then I'd drop it, just the smallest suggestion that maybe, just maybe, he should take the edge off. Maybe you should have a drink, I'd say, voice soft and innocent, the picture of concern. You've been working so hard lately. Just one, to relax. You deserve it. The first time he hesitated, I knew I had him. He wasn't a drinker, not really. But the idea appealed to him, the thought of unwinding, of loosening the grip on his own control. And slowly, I pushed him deeper into that world. A drink after work. Then 2. Sometimes 3. The weekends were worse, longer nights of him slurring his words, stumbling, his eyes clouded with alcohol-induced fog. And I watched it happen, all of it, with no remorse. At first, he resisted. I could see it in his eyes. The guilt. The shame. But that only made it sweeter. He'd try to hide it, come home sober, say he was taking a break from drinking, but I would just smile, play the role of the supportive wife. I knew he couldn't stay strong forever. And eventually, the bottle would make its way back into his hand, like a lover he couldn't resist. But I didn't care about his struggles. I didn't care about his need for control, his desire to be perfect. I didn't even care about how he treated me, how he loved me in the only way he knew how. Because, deep down, I knew I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it for me. I had to break him. I had to see him fall. There were times, when he came home late, smelling of whiskey and regret, that I could almost hear him begging for forgiveness in his silence. His face would be drawn, his eyes hollow, like a man who had lost his way. And I would simply watch him, my lips curving into a smile. I remember one night, just a few weeks ago, when the cracks in his perfect facade were so obvious, I couldn't help but enjoy it. He had been out late with clients, and when he came home, he was drunk in a way I had never seen before. His tie was askew, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes were glazed over. "You've been drinking," I remarked, my tone flat. He looked at me, his face flushed with shame. "Just a couple drinks," he mumbled. "You don't mind, do you?" Of course, I didn't mind. In fact, it was exactly what I wanted. But I didn't tell him that. Instead, I pretended to be the concerned wife. "I think you've had enough," I said, my voice gentle, as if I were truly worried about his well-being. He shook his head, his expression one of frustration. "I'm fine," he insisted, though his words were slurred. I just needed something to take the edge off. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." I nodded sympathetically, even as a part of me reveled in the sight of him so vulnerable. "I know, Daniel," I said softly, stepping closer to him, my hand on his arm. "I know you're under a lot of pressure. But you don't have to handle it alone." And there it was, my trap. He was hooked. In his weakened state, he needed me more than ever. And in return, I would take what I wanted. The control. The power. The next morning, I could see the after-effects of his drinking. The empty bottle on the counter. The faint smell of alcohol on his breath as he kissed me goodbye. But there was no guilt in me. No second thoughts. I was doing what had to be done. The house was quiet again, but inside me, everything was alive. He had taken the bait, and now it was only a matter of time before I pushed him even further, made him lose more of himself until he was begging for my forgiveness. Until he was begging for my love. But I would never give it to him. Not truly. I wanted him broken, desperate. And I would make sure he stayed that way. And so, I smiled to myself, watching the perfect mask of my life crack just a little more. The days blurred together as Daniel's behavior grew more erratic, more desperate. I could see it in the way he walked into the house, his shoulders slumped, the haunted look in his eyes. The man who had once carried himself with such assurance was slowly becoming a stranger to me, and I couldn't help but feel a sick thrill at watching him unravel. It wasn't just the alcohol anymore. No, that was only the surface. What I had done was much deeper. I had chipped away at his very soul, piece by piece, and I could feel him crumbling under the weight of his own inadequacies. He was slipping, and I was right there, pulling him deeper into the hole I had made for him. I'd watch him try to pretend everything was fine. He'd come home, trying to put on a mask of normalcy for our children, but it never lasted. The smile would fade, the tension would return, and eventually, he'd retreat to the comfort of a glass of whiskey, as if it could wash away the guilt that was slowly consuming him. The worst part was that he didn't even realize what was happening. He thought the alcohol was his escape, his way of coping. But what he didn't see was that I was the one leading him down this path. Every time he picked up the bottle, I was there, silently guiding him further into his addiction. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Daniel came home late. He'd had an important meeting with clients, one that had gone badly, and I could tell by the look on his face that he was spiraling. He didn't even greet me when he walked through the door. Instead, he made a beeline for the liquor cabinet. I didn't need to say a word. He was already too far gone. I watched from the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest, as he poured himself a drink, the glass shaking slightly in his hands. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale from exhaustion, but it didn't matter. The alcohol was his lifeline now, his only refuge from the weight of the world that seemed to be pressing in on him. "You're drinking again," I said, my voice soft but steady. He turned to face me, his lips twisted into something that could have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he said, though his words slurred slightly. Just need to take the edge off. You wouldn't understand. I understand more than you think, I replied, stepping closer to him, my gaze unwavering. I know the pressure you're under, Daniel. I know it's been hard. But this isn't helping. He shook his head, frustration flashing in his eyes. I'm not some charity case, he snapped. I can handle it. I don't need you to pity me. His words stung, though I didn't let it show. I'm not pitying you, I said, my tone calm. But you need to stop. You're losing yourself in this. The man I married, he's not here anymore. His face faltered for a moment, guilt flickering behind his eyes, but he quickly masked it with anger. Maybe I'm not who you wanted me to be. Maybe I'm not good enough for you anymore. The words hit harder than I expected. It was a crack in his armor, a chink in the facade he'd so carefully built over the years. I could see him unraveling, and I relished it. He was starting to doubt himself, to question his own worth. You've always been good enough for me, I said softly, stepping even closer. But you've let yourself go. You've become weak, Daniel. And it's tearing you apart. He recoiled at my words, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't want to believe it, but part of him knew I was right. He was weak, and I had made him that way. Slowly, methodically, I had eroded everything that made him who he was. Please don't say that, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I'm trying. I'm trying to fix this. But it's hard. I smiled softly, but there was no warmth in it. I know it's hard. But it's too late for that, Daniel. You've already lost. The words stung, and I knew they would. He would try to fight back, but it wouldn't matter. I had him exactly where I wanted him. The next few days passed in a blur. Daniel was distant, more withdrawn than usual, and it seemed like every time I looked at him, I could see the weight of his failure settling deeper into his bones. The children noticed too, though they didn't understand what was happening. They only knew that Daddy was different, more irritable, more tired, more absent. I made sure to keep up the charade, though. I played the loving wife, the supportive mother, while secretly watching him deteriorate. Every time he came home with that tired look in his eyes, I saw it as a victory. I was winning. Slowly, but surely, I was tearing him down. And what was worse was that he was letting me. By the end of the week, Daniel's drinking had escalated even further. The nights became longer, the mornings heavier. He would wake up with a pounding headache, his hands shaking as he tried to get dressed for work, but he was never truly present anymore. And as the days passed, I could feel his dependence on me growing, just as mine on him had. I had pushed him to the brink, and now I was the one holding all the power. One evening, he came home late again, stumbling through the door with an empty bottle in his hand. He barely made it to the living room before collapsing on the couch, his eyes glazed over. I watched him from the doorway, the cool indifference in my gaze. Daniel, I said, my voice steady, even though part of me wanted to laugh at how pitiful he had become. Look at you. He looked up at me, his eyes glassy, and for a brief moment, I saw the man he used to be. He was broken now, a hollow shell of himself. And in that moment, I felt nothing. Not sadness, not guilt. Just emptiness. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I know I've let you down. But I didn't care. He had let himself down long before. I stepped closer, my gaze cold, calculating. You've let us all down, Daniel, I said softly, my words hanging in the air. And now you have to live with that. I left him there, broken and desperate, and walked away. As I heard the sound of his sobs fading behind me, I couldn't help but smile. He was mine now. Completely and utterly mine. I watched him, the man I had slowly, carefully, and deliberately destroyed. He had become a shadow of his former self, his once confident stride now a shuffle, his eyes hollow with self-loathing. The transformation had been gradual, but now it was complete. He was a shell, and I could feel the control I held over him pulsing through me like a drug. The power had always been mine, and now, as I looked at him in the corner of the room, I felt an almost sick sense of satisfaction. Daniel had been fighting so hard, desperately trying to fix what was broken, to pull himself back together. He had gone to therapy, started trying to quit drinking, and made promises to me, promises I knew he would never keep. His desperation was almost laughable now. How could he possibly think he could undo the damage I had done? How could he think that he could earn my forgiveness after everything he had become? A part of me wanted to feel something, anything. A twinge of guilt, perhaps, or a flicker of regret for the damage I had caused. But I didn't. Instead, there was just a cold emptiness. He had already given me everything I wanted, and now there was nothing left to take. The game had been won. I had made him beg, I had made him plead, and yet, I still couldn't find it in me to feel anything other than indifference. His voice broke through my thoughts, ragged and desperate. "Please," Daniel whispered from across the room, his head hanging low. I can't keep doing this to you. To us. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I will change. I'll do anything. Just tell me how." His hands trembled as he reached out toward me, his face a mask of exhaustion and regret. He looked pathetic, and for a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But I didn't speak. I just watched him try so hard to hold on to something that was already slipping through his fingers. I'd seen this before. The pleading. The broken promises. And it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "You think I'm going to forgive you?" My voice was calm, almost detached, and I could see the confusion flicker in his eyes. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. He was too far gone now, too wrapped up in his own guilt and shame to comprehend the truth. "No," I continued, my gaze cold as I looked at him. "You've already lost, Daniel. You lost the moment you decided to let me control you. You lost the moment you believed you were good enough for me. The truth is, you never were. You were never enough for me. You never will be." He recoiled as though I had slapped him, the pain evident on his face. The man I had once loved, or at least thought I loved, was no longer there. In his place was this broken, hollow man, begging for redemption that I would never give. "I thought you cared," he whispered, almost too softly for me to hear. His voice cracked under the weight of his own despair. "I thought you loved me. But there was nothing left for me to give. I had used him up. And now, he was just a reminder of everything I had done to reach this point. The truth was, I had never loved him. Not truly. I had loved the idea of him, loved the way he could be molded and controlled. But love? That was never part of the equation. "You don't understand," I said, shaking my head, my voice low and icy. "I never loved you. I never needed to. You were just a pawn. A tool. And now, I've won. I've taken everything from you, and you've given it to me willingly." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of my words hanging between us like a thick fog. I saw the final flicker of hope die in his eyes, replaced by something colder, something darker. A part of me felt satisfaction, but mostly, I just felt numb. There was no joy in this for me. There was only the emptiness of a victory that meant nothing anymore. He stared at me for a long time, his breath shallow, his face contorted in disbelief. He was still trying to piece together the fragments of a reality where he could win me back, where he could fix everything. But there was no fixing this. There was no redemption. And I was done pretending that I ever cared. "You've broken me," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "You've taken everything from me." I nodded slowly, the words coming easily now. "Good. You deserve nothing. You always have." His face twisted in anguish, but there was no longer any fight in him. The man who had once been so confident, so self-assured, was gone. There was nothing left. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I never meant to." His words trailed off, and I could see the last of his resolve crumble. He was finished. And so was I. I took one last look at him, the man I had so thoroughly destroyed, and turned away. There was no point in dragging this out any longer. The door slammed shut behind me, the final sound of our marriage breaking. And for the first time in months, I felt truly free. Free from him, free from his expectations, free from the weight of pretending that I ever cared. As I walked away from him, the emptiness inside me spread, but this time, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like a victory. He had begged for forgiveness, had pleaded for my love, and I had given him nothing. He was mine now, completely and utterly broken, and I was free to do whatever I wanted. I smiled as I left, a smile that wasn't out of happiness, but out of something darker, something far more satisfying. I had turned him into an alcoholic, made him beg, and watched him fall. And in the end, I had come out on top. There was no remorse. There was no regret. There was only victory.